Hey, how are you?
Good
Welcome
man.
back.
So
So you did the doobly doo.
I did.
Yeah.
So this week we're talking about porters.
We are. This week we're talking porters. Um,
I'm stoked. This is one of my favorite styles of beer.
I like that.
I was actually considering drinking
I bet you were.
um
It would be an
because
appropriate beverage for the topic.
this beer um from Collective Arts I bought two.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I would have bought 12. It is my understanding that the Kentucky Bastard barrels got used on that beer this year
Oh, really?
instead of 2018 Kentucky Bastard. That's
Why?
my
Why? I wonder.
I don't know. That's my understanding. It could be wrong.
You'll
But
have to
that's
go for a visit, and poke and prod, and see what the answer is.
yeah, that's sort of my understanding of the situation. But nevertheless, I've had that beer. And I bought two, one for me and one for you. Oh, it's good. Oh, it's good.
I
But
have no doubt that's the case.
this beer
Wait a
is
minute. Whoa, whoa, hold on.
unopened.
Whoa. Hold on. Are you telling me there was no 2018 Kentucky Bastard?
That is my understanding.
So the Kentucky Bastards that I have in my fridge that were to enable us to do a year-over-year taste test of Kentucky Bastard versus Kentucky Bastard are now no longer useful for that purpose.
Hmm.
So that means now that those bottles of Kentucky Bastard that I have, I can just drink them.
Mm-mm. We can just drink them.
You got a really long garden hose? Just saying.
I do have a case of the 17, like right there. I can see it.
See, so all of a sudden, I'm pretty sure you just invalidated your point.
Yeah.
All right.
Pretty sure.
Mental note. We'll keep that in the back burner for a while.
Yeah.
Um,
Nevertheless,
so
I
question:
couldn't bring myself to it because,
Is
like I
Kentucky
said,
is Kentucky Bastard a porter?
I don't think so, man.
So this beginneth the beer education. What is a porter?
Yeah.
The porter is a dark beer akin to a stout. A stout being what you would think of if you thought Guinness, for example.
Well, Guinness is technically a double stout.
Sure, whatever, but it's a
Technically.
stout.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
it's an
the
oatmeal stout.
OG I
Yeah,
think the OG of a Guinness is like 1075 or something like that. And that's kind of what defines levels of porters. It's sort of like the doubles and triples and quads in Belgium that are sort of defined by the alcohol percentage, even though they are a specific style. The porter, as we know it, um, is historically it's a British Isles beer. It was brought over in I think this late 1780s, something like that,
okay, yeah.
from dudes returning from war in Africa. Um, the styles were sort of amalgam, because it was England was all pale ale.
Yeah, yeah, it was. Like the English
Yeah,
were heavy into the pale ale, and it was
yeah,
these. Yeah, there were There was a lot of variability in what was considered what in 1800s brewing in England.
Yeah,
Because there was a pale ale on the south coast and a pale ale on the north coast were totally different things.
Oh yeah, well same as like California pale ale and a New England IPA.
Yeah,
and
so there was that variability. So I think though modern understanding of the difference between pilsners and stouts is probably something fairly valid to discuss. I don't know why my CPU is spiking right now. I genuinely have no idea. No.
Got an idea.
My CPU is spiking. I'm just going to keep an eye on some things here because something's going haywire.
I don't care about your computer.
I know you don't, but I sure do. I don't know why, but anyway, excuse me. I can only guess that somebody is trying to watch something, and that's going haywire.
I just ban everybody at the router level, dude.
Yeah, I could certainly do that. Like I said, it's for me. It's more the CPU.
The phone that I'm trying to use right now to access information, banned at the router level because I'm stupid.
Yeah, like my CPU. Oh, I know what it is. Oh no, I don't know what it is. I thought I knew what it was, but I didn't. I am gonna do this though. Sorry, we're in the middle of a conversation and I'm doing this, so
yeah,
that sucks, but I'm doing it anyway. Basically, I'm taking down the Minecraft server.
In the first references of the term porter, just the term, is mid to late 1700s.
Okay.
It didn't start to catch stride until Thrall, Parsons, Truman, and Burton. All the breweries at the time on that side of the Trent River, basically.
Right.
Because the water that comes from that side, specifically the Burton-on-Trent wells, are probably the most recognized modern porter water.
Yeah, and it's the water that sort of has set a standard for what brewing is supposed to be. So yeah, that makes sense.
But those regions, that region was sort of the genesis cradle for the porter style in, let's say, 1800 approximately, and it really was catching stride by 1860, 1870.
Did you find when you were doing your research that there was any real definition of what the porter was with respect, like in comparison to a stout?
Yes.
Okay, give me 1 second. I've got to run upstairs quickly and solve a problem that was unexpected.
Okay, I'm gonna drink beer and I'm gonna.
You do that. You do that, and you jibber jabber, and I'll be right back. I'm not even gonna change the camera for this.
You guys really gotta get a tap. Okay, so until about 1800. No, let me put it to you this way. So you got to understand how beer was, and to many degrees still is, made and sold in England. English beer is very low alcohol. It is usually half fermented by the time it ships. Most English beer, especially English beer from 300 years ago, would finish fermenting. It would finish fermenting in the bottom cellar of the bar that it was shipped to. And porter was classified because it had a higher starting gravity. So there was more fermentable sugar. Big porters could be as high as 1080, 1085. And they would,
which is so low by modern standards.
yeah. All right. Like traditional imperials.
Yeah.
Were only 1095. I can get 1095 with my eyes closed in my kitchen now.
Look at that! What a nice guy.
Because of the distribution method, they would make a 1040.
Cheers, Joe Bruce.
They would make a 1040 beer on the same day or the next day that they made their 1080.
Right.
And they would ship them to the bar at the same time, and the bar would put them both on pumps. That's the
beer engines. Yeah.
It's the 1780 version of a beer tap. It's called a pump or a beer engine.
Mm-hmm.
You basically squeeze it. It's a bladder system that makes your beer flat. So porters usually had a more voracious fermentation,
and a higher alcohol content.
And they were sweeter, and they had a higher alcohol percentage. But we're talking about a country that's used to 4.5% beers getting a 6.5% beer and being like, right?
They got the vapors.
Yeah. In the modern age, I'm drinking a 9%, and that bottle right there is a 13.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, these two beverages would not be possible. Technically they would, but not
consistently.
Yeah.
And so the modern porter, the differentiation between them is now much deeper than just an alcohol bias. There are giant stouts and there are giant porters. So now it's taking the aspects, I think, of that original porter, the lighter mouthfeel, the more watery feel of a porter because it had more alcohol.
Yep.
That now is sort of becoming one of the identifying characteristics. So when you have a stout tends to be a big, chewy mouthful. It tends to be a fairly heavy beer. It tends to be a beer that sort of tastes treacle thick. Not necessarily sweet, but thick.
A porter can be crisp and clean and bright.
And 13% and still have all of those flavors, but it's just it's got a very different kind of drink to it. It's not not something you feel like you could eat with a spoon. Right? You know
to
me stouts are soupy and porters are dribbly.
You know the number one contribution to beer that porter made? Beer wasn't brewed with sacramental or hygrometers, whatever the
mm-hmm.
Porters were the first beer style that was accurate.
Where the actual science of brewing started to creep in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everything else was a touch and a feel, and it looks right, and it feels right, and it smells right, and this is what Granddad told us to do, and
it works. That does work.
It worked. Yeah. And dude, there are still places that make that sort of beer,
and I don't think that's a problem.
The science of beer was invented. I don't want to say invented, but it was it started to become the norm. It initiated itself.
Yeah.
In Ireland, actually, because the first porters came from Ireland. It wasn't Guinness, but the porters came from Ireland, and the English were like, "Oh, that's great," and it so happened that the water profile around Burton-on-Trent was very conducive to very good flavors and
good malt flavors,
right?
Yeah.
And like even to this day, like Fuller's London Porter is a fucking glorious beer.
Yeah. That was that break was, you said 1840s? Does that sound right? Give or take.
I gotta pull up the PDF, but I think it was 1830s, 1840s, and I think Guinness didn't start brewing until the 1870s, 1880s.
Okay, so that was a fair turn. Joe Bruce in the chat was asking, do we know anything about religion in brewing, and what time period were we all talking about? So the time period in terms of the porter stout differentiation. Cheers, man.
Hey, thanks to you,
Adams. That differentiation sort of, we'll call it mid 1800s. That's a really interesting question, though, Joe Bruce. We're going to save that for the next little bit. We're going to wrap up on this whole porter discussion here in a moment, and then we'll circle back to that, because I think that's a really interesting question, and it's an incredibly appropriate question.
And dude, I like this style in particular. Like, I could easily talk your ear off for an hour.
I could easily drink that stuff until I pass out.
Oh yeah, dude.
If I have to pick a single style that I like more than any other, porter's in the running. Like it really is. It's there's a couple of different styles of Belgian I like. I like porters. I'm not as big into stouts as I am porters. I don't like a heavy beer. It's not my preference.
I do. It's.
Yeah. Well, that's fine.
But yeah, no. The history of porters is the history of modern brewing.
Yeah, that's a well said sentence.
Yeah,
because it is. That was when water became a question.
Yeah,
and when an understanding of why my water makes better beer than your water.
Right. So, like, as a brewer, as a home brewer, you don't need to care about water. You don't.
No.
Like, dude,
there's a point where you absolutely can.
Yeah.
But you don't need to.
You can't. Dude, you absolutely can get nuts about it. But, like, to brew a straight up and down ABC beer, that's awesome. You don't have to care about that shit.
Yeah, it's too much work.
Yeah.
It's way too much work.
How do you just like... Yeah. But the Black Eagle Brewery in Stoke-on-Trent.
Yes.
That is...
I'm like, I don't remember them being in Ontario.
No. That's the original Truman Brewery.
Oh, okay.
And that brewery is where...
Well, and they were open, 1730, 1750?
Yeah, I think I can't remember, but in the early 1700s.
Early 1700s, yeah.
But... shit, what's his name? Thomas...
Who, Fawcett?
Something or another. No, Buxton. Thomas something Buxton.
Now you just look bad because you don't remember. It's okay. Don't sweat it, Let's circle away from that. We'll come back to it because it'll pop into your head.
But wait, so his brewery was there was another dude who his name is Sir Benjamin Truman.
Okay.
Super important dude in the history of beer. He was a scientist. Oh, Thomas Fowell Buxton. He was a scientist, so had access to scientific measuring tools and stuff like that. And that's sort of how the him wanting to understand what was going on molecularly, and that's where that's where the precision that is modern Belgian beer came through the history of porters.
Which is an interesting dovetail into Joe Bruce's question, because when you start talking about religion and beer, one would argue that monastic tradition in Europe is sort of that was the beginning and the middle of sort of beer in Europe. And then the changes that came from English brewing and Irish brewing sort of reinvented monastic brewing, and then they picked up a mantle of the responsibility for the scientific education, because the identification of most of the yeasts that are used was done by the monasteries.
Right, but you have to remember too that the golden age of monastic brewing was the Napoleonic age.
Yes.
And at the beginning of Napoleon's campaign, he instituted a malt tax.
Of course.
So, and it was how beer and alcohol and spirits is currently taxed is by the alcohol of the product out.
Mm-hmm. Napoleon taxed the grain going in.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So the monastic tradition was, we grow the grain, we brew the beer, we feed the grain to the cows, we make our own milk out of it, we cross that with beer. So the only places that didn't have to buy their grain were the monasteries. Because the tradition of, we can only use the things that we grow to support our order, which is the Trappist monk credo.
Yep. Thank you, Benedict.
That yeah.
Because that was part of the Benedictine philosophy, is that you operate a monastery,
you may take nothing from the land,
take nothing that you don't use, and use everything that you take, and that principle still holds today.
But what that meant was, at the time, 2 or 3 decades after this revolutionary look at beer science happened, the Belgians started taking the Chimay, Duvel.
Yeah, Duvel. Yeah.
Duvel's yeast, their yeast cell, because all Duvel beer is fermented with one type of yeast.
Yep.
That yeast was a Scottish porter yeast.
Yeah. Chimay was using their own yeast. It was a native Belgian yeast.
But dude, you have to understand.
But they didn't isolate it until the 1900s. Like, they didn't isolate. Chimay didn't isolate their own yeasts until the 40s, 50s, 60s.
Yes,
right?
dude that isolated the Chimay yeast is still alive.
He was 10 years ago anyway.
Yeah,
I don't remember
but no,
whether he
dude.
still is.
The monastic tradition encourages sharing. So all of the yeasts in Belgium, they would share and so on and so forth, and they would pass forth. Same as in England.
Mm-hmm.
It's much the same tradition as now. Like, I could show up at any brewery and be like, "Yo, can I grab a mason jar of yeast?" And they'll be like, "Yeah, what do you want? These are the 2 strains we've got."
Yeah.
It was the same thing. But the precision of porters at that time gave rise to all of the styles in Belgium.
Or at least what we recognize today.
Yeah, there is no more precision beer making happening than it is in Belgium.
Yeah. And those yeasts, they were arguably, they probably started as bread yeasts, because
they were
Ireland and England,
pale ale yeasts,
yeah,
dude.
but in England and Ireland, they don't have a huge fruit industry, aside from apples, and so there aren't a lot of fruit-borne yeast, and some and oranges, but they don't have a huge fruit-based yeast source. It's the grain that they get their yeast from, and therefore most of the yeasts were bread yeasts, which also contributed to the lower alcohol content, because bread yeasts tend to basically just pooter out at like six points. Like they just can't handle much more alcohol than that. So even today,
think of for the uninitiated, think of bread grains as diesel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And think of beer and spirit grains, brewing grains, as kerosene.
Yeah, they have a lot more embedded power.
Yeah, but they last
sugar.
long. They're more power for less amount of time.
Yeah, and so those yeasts.
So if you had a cereal that was full of 2-row barley, you would have 10 times as much energy at 8 o'clock when you eat your cereal, or an hour after you eat your cereal, but by 11 you would need a nap.
Yeah, you go to sleep. So
right, if you have Wheaties.
To answer the question in chat, the strains of yeast have different behaviors in the presence of sugar, and they have different. They produce different byproducts, or more appropriately, byproducts in different quantities. So a bread yeast is more geared to producing CO2.
Yeah.
And producing
leaven bread.
Yeah, they don't produce alcohol in any significant percentage, but they produce a lot of CO2.
You can brew a beer with Fleischmann's yeast.
Absolutely, you can.
Fleischmann's yeast in my cupboard right
100%, and you'll top out at 5.5%, 5.25% tops. So people who brew with bread yeast like Fleischmann's tend to have sweeter beers. They're not. Yeah. They tend to be a little bready too. Go figure. Because the same flavors that you get in a loaf of bread it's because the yeast put it there. So the strains,
things that brewers do, like traditional styles.
Yeah,
there's things that brewers do with modern malt to emulate the flavors off of old or bread yeasts.
Yep.
Like biscuit malt jumps to mind.
Yep, biscuit malt is one of those. Yes.
Biscuit malt.
Acidulated malt is like that too.
If you make a loaf of bread and you wet your yeast, so you let your yeast sit there and make like a bread starter.
Yep.
It smells exactly the same as if you mash up some biscuit malt.
Some well malted biscuit malt. Yeah. And so those yeasts absolutely do contribute to flavor, and I think that was a part of this practice that was going on mid 1800s, is that there was some experimentation going on with yeasts, which had not happened before. Prior
Because
to that, it was very much just wild yeast, and whatever you got was what you got. And I think what happened was there was a recognition that how they exposed the wort at the time to the air to get the yeast, because that's where it came from, and seasonality, they started to determine that, oh, hey, you know what? When we make it in the spring, it's sweeter than it is when we make it in the fall. So when we make it in the spring, let's fill some drums with the stuff that comes out the bottom, and we'll use that in the summer and in the fall when normally our beer doesn't taste quite the same. And that process is sort of that fundamental change to understanding and then impacting by intent the final flavor of the beer. And again, it was that same time period. And since the English and the Irish were the ones doing the most with beer at the time, like, I mean, the monastic world was just sort of chugging along, doing their thing. Like, nothing changed it. And you got to look at it, it's sort of a time capsule, right? They do things the same way at Chimay today as they did in 1780. They just have a little more smarts about it, right? They've learned better ways to do it. And that's come with technology and time. But it wasn't
they learned that you can buy things with money.
Sure, but in the time, they weren't dicking around with it. They had a product, they made it, and that's what they did. So
yeah, but the scale of which that they sold that product was nil.
Yeah, exactly. And so the
beer was,
and so the commercialization of beer in westernmost Europe is really what drove that change. And the yeast absolutely does affect flavor. Absolutely.
1880, the Trappist monasteries weren't selling their beer.
Yeah.
It was for their order.
Yes, it was. So there you go. So the porters came from that UK tradition and kind of, exploded all over Belgium and Germany and everywhere else. Well, I wouldn't say Germany. Germany had their own thing going on.
Well, it kind of touched, like,
eventually it did.
1570 is when Reinheitsgebot came about.
Well, 1684, I thought.
I mean the first one.
Oh.
Anyways, if you say 1684. If you say 1684, the Bavarians and that little hunk of Europe only had two things to play with.
1516 was the first iteration. Yes.
16. Okay.
1516.
So they only had two things to play with. In England, they could play with.
There were no rules.
They wanted. There was no rules, right?
But in Germany, there were rules
associated with it. So when the instruments of precision were brought to the group of people that only had two variables to work with, like, you can brew the exact same beer with a 2-row from France and a 2-row from Germany, and it tastes totally different.
Yeah.
You can brew the exact same recipe with a French malt, and instead of boiling it for 60 minutes, you boil it for 160 minutes, and it is an insanely different beer. Once the porter provided the methods of precision that made the European beers great.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So the porter just ain't the dark beer. It's got some history too.
It's good shit.
It's good shit.
Drink porter.
All right. So as we switch back into homebrew mode then, really quickly.
Thanks for letting me nerd out on that.
Hey, man, that's cool.
I love that.
As we head back into the homebrew world, just a real quick answer to the chat. So yes, the different yeasts absolutely have different flavors. Depending on the nature of the yeast, they can add literally flavors. You can get bubblegum and banana and clove and spice and all kinds of things just from the yeast. So they absolutely do that. They also have varying capabilities as far as alcohol production goes. Some of them can only handle, 4% alcohol, and then they die off, or not so much die off, but they go to sleep. Others can handle 16, 17% alcohol before they start to peter out. They all have different expressions of flavor is probably the best way to put it. Yeast is a single-celled organism. It has a mouth hole and a butthole of sorts, and it eats sugar out of the liquid, and it farts CO2, and it takes a big pee with some alcohol. And while it does that, it sweats, and when it sweats, that's those flavors, those esters and phenols that come from the yeast that add those extra flavors. That's why Belgian beers taste like Belgian beers. A lot of it is because Belgian yeast now have very specific ester and phenol profiles.
Okay, so in the
have a direct
world,
impact on that beer.
Yeah, and I can add on that, Greg. So in the medical world, the reason that we do experiments on mice is because how fast they breed. So how fast you can get from this training to 5 generations down, and you can sort of socialize what's going on.
Yeah.
There is no organism on Earth that reproduces at the rate that yeast does.
Yeah, it can be a doubling of a population in under 5 hours.
Yeah.
So you could literally
you could go from 10,000 yeast cells to 2 billion yeast cells in 3 days.
In just a few days. And when we pitch yeast into beer as homebrewers, we typically pitch 1 million to 1.5 million cells on day one.
Yeah.
And that first day tends to be very subtle because we're waking that yeast up. It hasn't done anything. And then they wake up and they're like...
In days 2 through 6
and then they're like, holy shit, I am swimming in food.
Yeah.
I am hungry as a motherfucker because I'm going to sleep for a while. And they start eating. And there is... I mean, they're asexual, right? Yeast don't breed per se. No. They are, for all intents and purposes, clones. So every yeast that is in a batch of yeast in a strain is identical to one another. They're just in a different state of growth.
Yes.
And so
I could do if
they'll bud 3 times, 4 times before they go to sleep. They go dormant. And when they go dormant, they will recover. I suspect there are yeast out there who have been through hundreds, if not thousands of batches.
Oh, dude, there. I guarantee you that there are yeast cells that have been through millions of fermentations.
Oh, probably, yes. And certainly the ones outside. Who are the kings of the beer world? What country really leads the way? I would have said...
Dude, it's such a hard question.
I mean, 100 years ago, I would have said it was Germany, it was Britain, and it was... and I'm gonna add a qualifier to that, because in order to be a king of the beer world, that means somebody's buying it, and so you can then eliminate all of those that are subsistence level. So you're only talking commercial, and commercial brewing has only been around for maybe 125 years, maybe, probably less, because prior to that. You know,
you're out of your mind. Commercial.
No. But I mean, in terms of walking, in terms of walking in and buying a 6-pack, like in terms of a commercial retail, a commodity purchase, right? That's less than the last 100 years.
No,
but you could certainly have gone into a hotel and dropped a halfpenny on the counter and gotten yourself a glass of beer.
No, it's not. It's not that.
It's 300 years ago.
The commercial selling of beer used to be significantly more wholesale. It used to go from the brewery to the publicans, but there was still significant home sale of beer from breweries. Significant. But it was just in a different format.
And it was across town, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't exported. It wasn't.
Exactly.
That didn't happen until the last 100 years.
I agree with that 100%. But
prior to that, it was cottage industry.
Fear-based commerce.
Yeah, it was cottage industry. And it was rent in the 1700s and the 16 and 1500s. That's how you paid your landlord. I mean, so it was commercialized, but that didn't make the brewer a king of beer, right? Big breweries, the biggest breweries in Germany were actively brewing and selling in the 1600s, as early as the 1600s. If I wanted to say, you know, what brewery has got the biggest dollar value in terms of being the king, you would have to break it down to the source of the brewery when it was still an independent brewery. Because today, the kings of the beer world, Sapporo Ichiban, Miller Coors, SAB Miller Coors, and Anheuser-Busch in Bev. And that's it. Those are the three. Everybody else is a rounding error on a rounding error. Yeah. There's every craft brewer in America is less than 5% of the American beer industry.
Every not brewer, then like the three that Greg said.
Yep.
And then everybody else over here, 7%.
Yeah, it's insane.
Of the world beer market.
Yeah. So the kings, those are the three kings right now.
Let me put it to you this way.
But Germany, it would be Germany.
Every single hop plant, every single hop pellet grown in Africa is owned by Anheuser-Busch. The entire continent's supply of hops is owned by one company.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say, you know, what country really led the way. There were three, four, five really parallel brewing industries, though. Germany's industry was very parallel with Czechoslovakia. They were reasonably parallel with Belgium. And then the rest was in England and Ireland, predominantly England.
Yeah.
And that was sort of where it all came from. Do the top three deserve to be there? That's a really philosophical question, Joe Bruce.
Yes.
Of course they do.
Without question,
They're businesses. Of course they do. They made money, spent money, acquired competition, created new industry. Do they deserve to be there? Of course they do. Absolutely.
If you gave me $10 million 200 years ago, it wouldn't be called AB InBev. It would be called LB Wilkin Bev.
Yeah. Yeah, because he'd have done the same thing.
I'd have done exactly the same. And I have a policy in my life that I refuse to be mad at somebody for doing a thing that I would do myself, given their position.
Yeah, I mean, it's really one of those tough lines to walk. Craft beer is built on a movement of effectively cottage industry and collaboration and small businesses doing things they love and community. That does not jive with AB InBev, SAB Miller Coors, Labatt's, whoever you want to call part of that, and they're all conglomerated anyway. So they don't live in that world. But if I'm a guy who's running a brewery, I've been doing it for 5 years, I'm taking over five figures, 6 figures a year, and SAB Coors says, "Hey, we really like what you're doing. We want to buy your brewery," and they say, "Here's $1.5 million." How stupid do you have to be to say?
They wouldn't say, "Here's $1.5 million." They'd say, "Here's 20 mil."
Yeah, and we're going to do this and this. What do you say? You say yes. So I don't have malice towards those breweries that have been purchased by the big dogs and who've grown the big dogs.
Steam Whistle, Alexander Keats.
Yeah, I mean, pick pretty much anything on the main shelves at a store in this country.
Yeah,
or your country.
Goose Island.
Goose Island.
Goose Island is owned by Labatt's. which
But
is a Miller Coors proposition.
yeah, so but in fairness, I
Shot
also
top.
prefer. Not only do I prefer the beer produced by craft brewers, the small guys, much the same way people like their farmers market produce, right? Part of it is idealistic, and part of it is preference. AB InBev isn't going to make a 12% porter because they can't sell enough of it to make it cost effective to produce. And so that's what you get.
Yeah, the reason that beer tastes like how it does is because it's cheaper for them to use 30% corn.
Yeah. And they've been doing it that way and have the production built to do that. So they can reproduce
could AB InBev make an all malt, great tasting, light American style lager?
Yeah.
Sure they could. And it'd probably only cost them 3 cents, 2 cents more per case. But it'd cost them $25 billion in retooling of their breweries.
Yeah. So they're just not going to do it. So hence why I stick with the craft side. And I think the craft side, that's the other thing that has and this sort of leads into our second topic for the night, which is why the hell would somebody brew their own beer? It comes down to flexibility. When you are brewing, 25 hectoliters or 50 hectoliters of beer,
you gotta be tight.
You gotta be smart, and you take chances on every batch because it's a real thing. I mean, AB InBev does a brew here in Edmonton, and they do 500,000 hectoliters. They do train cars of beer, whereas a typical craft brewer couldn't fill half of a train car. Right, dude, on their big tanks.
You and me on your system, my system, and Lance's system, it would take us.
Oh, we couldn't do it.
It'd take us probably 16 or 18 months to fill a train car.
Going full time, right? It's just not practical. The advantage, though, is because we're working in smaller volumes, because we're working in smaller batches, as it does the craft brewers, it means that we have the flexibility to change it up all the time. So if I decide, bam, I've been drinking IPAs for a year and a half and I really just don't like them anymore, then I can change it up and start building a recipe for something else. And I don't have 140 people and 6-month order lead time that I have to worry about.
God, I would love to have that.
I just go down and hit my LHBS and say, "What do you got?" And they go, "Well, I got this and this and this and this." And if they've got this and this and this, well, then I can build something that I want to drink based on that, rather than the big dogs. So they don't have that fleet of foot behavior. Now, in terms of and this was a question Joe asked, was, what does it cost? That's the other reason I think there's value to learning to do this. A 12-pack of shitty beer is like $30. It's like $18 in Alberta.
Oh, 12 packs. Sorry.
Yeah. Like a case of shitty beer in Alberta is
$26.
Call it $20 by the time you drive to the store and you get home. Call it $20. Cannabucks, Canadian bucks. They're worth a little less than Ameribucks. But they have
Kazakhstan kopecks.
Yeah, but all of our money has, a bunch of our money has women on it because we're progressive. Anyway, so that's for 12 bottles, right? 12 bottles of beer.
You could have one of those full.
Yes.
5 gallons of beer
for $30.
25, 30.
Depending. That's $25-$30. Now, obviously,
you'd
have to buy the thing to hold it.
you could brew a comparable alcohol and flavored beer.
Yes.
That fills this container.
Yes, for $30, $25 easy.
Well, $20, dude.
Yeah, probably. So
20 bucks,
that's
20
a big
bucks
part of it.
in 2 hours worth of your time.
The difference, the big difference is there's a little bit more work involved, obviously doing it yourself.
Sure.
But as one who arts for a living, Joe, you probably understand that the process has value too. It's not just
wildly therapeutic.
The value of doing that work, and having a product at the end that has value, is sometimes worthwhile too. We don't tend to pay ourselves when we do things that we enjoy. You have somebody who likes to cook. They don't think about the 2 hours prep time to make a meal. They think about the meal, right?
Yeah, and dude, and I can give you a perfect example. Like over Christmas, we had a pseudo office Christmas party. A bunch of friends got together. I brewed 5 gallons of beer and 5 gallons of cider. My total cost is probably about $50.
Yeah.
And it took me probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 hours. The feeling of like the fulfillment of somebody experiencing and appreciating your art. Like I have seldom experienced that appreciation in the last 10 years.
And you'd have done it again for 5 times the price, and you wouldn't have even thought about it.
Yeah, I made one of my best friend's employees' wife puke. Because it was so good she couldn't stop drinking.
That's funny.
So,
and horrible but funny. Funny.
Like they were out at their boss's party.
Yeah.
And got so drunk that she puked.
So why?
It was so good.
Yeah. So why do people homebrew? And that's, I think, a really simple question, and it's got a complicated answer. No surprise.
It feels good.
It feels good.
That's the answer.
It's
cool.
You know,
art.
It is no different than why do people who love to cook? Why do they spend $28 on a tomahawk steak? Right? Does it taste good? Of course it tastes good. But you could make an $8 steak taste great too. So why do they get the tomahawk? Because they want to cook it. Because they want to cook it, right? Why do you do artichoke? They're a pain in the ass. They're a ton of time. Are there other vegetables that are good? Of course, but artichoke is. It's more. There's you've got to put some soul into it. You got to put some heart into it to make it work. That's what brewing is all about. If you and then, you know, when you do take that step back, it's a huge spectrum. Like, you don't have to have $500 worth of gear to do it. You can. Absolutely. Luke will show you in our video.
If you want to spend $500 on brewing, I've got a video for that.
Yeah.
But you know what, dude?
But you can do it for free.
I could turn this camera around right now
and make beer.
And with the shit that's
I know
house,
artichokes are such a bitch. I hate cooking them. They
suck.
Yeah, but I don't like eating them either.
In my house with maybe $4, $5 worth of grain.
Yeah, and that's the cool part is that to do a batch at home, you don't have to do 50 bottles. You can do 5 or 6 bottles. Save some of your beer bottles.
A friend of yours make a custom fermentation vessel.
Right.
And brew 2 liters.
Yeah. I was gonna say I thought I had a thing down here, but I don't. Yeah, like you can easily brew on a stovetop. Ferment in it.
I brewed that beer that I took
ferment
to my friend.
Ferment in a 1 gallon demijohn.
Yep.
And bottle that into leftover pop bottles if you wanted to, right? With screw-on plastic caps. Nothing wrong with that. It'll work just fine.
You don't even
can
need to buy
absolutely do
expensive
that.
cleaners. Like
And
like no shit. You can take like rubbing alcohol,
actually, even easier, you do like
vodka.
no, it's like 1 part bleach. It's like an ounce and a half of bleach in 2 gallons of water. You can't even
Yeah,
smell it, but it's enough to sanitize it.
yeah,
It is so simple to make sure things are clean, and then you use the tools you have. That's how it was done for hundreds of years. It was a pot on the stove and a bag, a muslin bag to
yeah,
hold the grain. Like there's no rocket science here, and that's one of the things that over the course of our series of videos that we've done and the ones we're doing, additional ones that are coming. We're going to look at that and we're going to talk about just how easy it is, because it really is easy. It's freakishly easy. So simple. Yeah. So anyway, so the real root to the result of the question of why, it's kind of a because it's there. There is something that you will find, and granted, you're not a beer drinker. Okay. Then there are beers that you can make that are sort of on the border of beer,
yeah,
that may not be a true beer, but will provide you the same outlet with a different end result and still be effectively the exact same process. Whether
yeah.
you make a Groot or whether you make a mead, or it doesn't matter. You make a mead, you're just not using grain, you're using honey. You make a Groot, you're using fruit and grain as well. Like it's a matter of the recipe, right? But it's fundamentally the same in terms of practice. So
And it's simple. It's simple. It's easy, and there is an art to it. It's the same. Like anybody that's ever cooked a meal for somebody, and they're like, "Oh fuck, that's good,"
yeah,
or like made like dude like you made a cup for somebody, and they're like, "Fuck,
yeah.
that's so cool."
Yeah, there is something to be said for having family over for dinner, and you stand up
Yeah,
with a smile and pop the top off of a bottle of something you made, and you pour it, and everybody is sharing. And you're right, it is part of remembering
yeah,
roots. It is building family history.
yeah.
That all of those things fall into it, and that's why we do it, right? That's
And dude,
and
and
frankly, if you also just are a nerd, there's something very, very cool about the science of it.
yeah, and dude, like I just nerded out on the history of porters for an hour. I nerded out because it's so interesting.
It is.
Right? So why would you brew? It's an art. It's fun. It gives you a connection to other people
Yep.
more than going to your local package store, buying 35 Coors Lights for $8 and drinking until you pee your pants
Wow.
because it's 85% water.
There you have it.
It's, I hate to use the word, it's artisanal. It's human.
Yes. That's why we
It's
do
fun.
it. That's why we do
Yeah.
it. All right. So that's where we're gonna close out the official talkie bits, the official beery bits of this episode. And by all means, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube at a later date, by all means, come by on a Saturday night. Hit us up on Twitch, twitch.tv/Rysky Business, RYSKY Business, or hit us up at rysk.ca, rysk.ca, and we would be happy to enjoy your company.
Yeah, and if you've got questions or you want to see us cover anything on the shows, Greg's going to tell you what the next show is here in a second. But
Actually, I
shoot us a
probably
message
won't because
on-
I don't have it, but hit up rysk.ca. We publish our schedule there.
Yeah. If you have questions or anything like that, shoot us a message on on Twitter, or drop us a line on our Instagram. Links again can be found at rysk.ca, and we'll answer you there.
And by all means, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button if you're on YouTube, and hit the little bell next to it to be notified when the next episode gets uploaded. Cheers. We will see the live folks back in just a moment.